Hey y'all, welcome back to the book stamp. Wow, it's been a while since I've said that, but what better time to come back to BookTube than during Pride Month. So today I'm going to be doing the LGBTQ tag. I will be linking Anja's channel down in the description. She is the original creator of this tag, and if you're looking for queer book recommendations, she has so many videos like broken up by specifically what you're looking for, so I definitely recommend that you go and check that out. So let's go ahead and get into the questions. And the first one is, what is your favorite queer book that you've read this year? For me, that is 100%, like I've read a lot, but this one really rises to the cream of the crop. And that is Upright Women Wanted by Sarah Gailey. This is a short sci-fi novella set in like an post-apocalyptic American Southwest, and you have like lesbian cowboys and non-binary characters, and they're feminist librarians like working to make life better for everyone. It's so well done. It's like super emotional, like really like tugs on your heartstrings. There's action. There's like this character who is like sort of coming to accept that she is queer and a lesbian, while also like dealing with having like her whole idea of society like completely reframed, and I just loved it so much. Oh, I cried at the end. If you're looking for like a warm, happy, uplifting queer story, this is 100% what you should read. I think it's a great introduction to Sarah Gailey's work. I love it so much. For the next couple questions, it's basically following the LGBTQ acronym and with some like specific book recommendations. So the first prompt is, what is your favorite women loving women book or lesbian book? And well, I don't think you have to center romances for it to be considered a lesbian book. A book that I consider really does that really well while having lesbian characters and a romance, but that's not the main point of the book. Is definitely the Gideon the Ninth series by Tasman Muir. If you like queer, lesbian, sci-fi necromancers in space, go check that out. It's so different than anything else I've ever read. Highly recommend. But for like a more romance element, I'm going to recommend This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mohtar and Max Gladstone. This was like, I think, my second favorite book of 2020. I have it on my TBR to reread this year because I loved it so much, and now that I have a physical copy, I like want to go through and annotate it and just really like love this book. And so basically this book is following two time travel agents, Red and Blue, as they are both trying to change the timeline to better suit like their side, but in the meantime they end up falling in love. It is one of the most like beautifully written sci-fi novels where everything is sort of a metaphor, and it's just this really beautiful lyrical prose where they're leaving letters for each other in these really inventive, creative ways so that nobody can track them, and you're just like kind of following their story. You're kind of just dumped into this world, and it's definitely probably a more challenging sci-fi read, but if you like science fiction like and like lyrical prose, like if you like poetry, like I think you would really like this book. Definitely give it a try. I recommend reading it physically, personally, just because you actually get to really sit with the language, and I think it really works. But it's really short. Again, it's a novella. I went on a real big novella kick for a while, so definitely check this out. So next, it's list your favorite MLM book, man loving men book, or gay book. Like, I tried to come up with something like creative and out of the box or whatever, but my favorites are Red, White, and Royal Blue and The Song of Achilles. Like, they're so good. If you have been on BookTube and have not been convinced to read them, and you're watching a video like this, you should go read them. The books are phenomenal. They're so well done. But anyways, those books are just so good, and I think everybody really should read them. They're very like universal, just queer love stories, and they're beautiful. Like, they're so beautiful. I don't know what I can say that nobody else has already said about these two books, but definitely go and read them. Don't worry, I'm gonna have some more niche books coming up. For bisexual representation, what's your favorite book with a bisexual character? I am going to recommend An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. I actually only have A Beautifully Foolish Endeavor, which is the second book in the duology, but the duology is fantastic. The book's like, book one ends on a cliffhanger, so you're going to want to pick this up right away. Like, I have clearly annotated this quite a bit. And in these books, our main character, April May, who is a bisexual woman, basically stumbles upon this like alien that has landed on the earth in the form of this robotic statue. She's basically the first person to ever discover it, makes a video about it, uploads it to her YouTube channel at like 3 a.m. and becomes an international celebrity. And this book is just a beautiful treatise on like fame and what to do with power and like science, and it also has like this really strong undercurrent of like found family, and that like most of the characters in the book are queer. In the second book, we have a woman kind of coming to terms with her bisexuality, and I loved that so much. And I'm not gonna tell you who it is, but so you have these like great like love stories and romance, but also like this theme of discovery and found family, and like in this like science fiction universe. But this is definitely one of the more accessible science fiction books that I've recommended. So it really kind of it's not YA, but it kind of reads like a YA, like set 10 years from now type book. So, or set in our present day in an alternate time, you know. But I would definitely recommend these so much. And then we have our favorite book with trans representation. For my favorite book with trans representation, it is Detransition Baby by Tori Peters. This book, I like finished it, I think a couple days ago, and I have not been thinking about anything else. This book basically follows our three characters, Ames, Reese, and Katrina. Ames is a man who has originally transitioned to be a woman and then detransitions back to where he uses he, him pronouns and identifies as a man. And he accidentally gets his cis partner, Katrina, pregnant. And sort of after that happens, he comes up with the idea, because he's still not super comfortable being a man and really doesn't see himself ever being a father figure, to bring his ex-partner, Reese, in, who's a trans woman who desperately wants to have her own child. And it's just this really, really like soap opera-y style like book. So it's written very plainly like how people speak and conversate to each other. I will say it's kind of advanced on the like queer spectrum. Like there are a lot of references to stuff in queer life and like queer culture that if you are not super familiar with the culture, you may not get. Like I even found myself like Googling some people that they would name drop certain people in the trans scene that I wasn't really familiar with. So having my phone there to Google some stuff was really nice. But this is definitely not a like trans 101 book. It really tries to sort of, I think, break that trans women are women, trans men are men, like basicness, and really show the complex inner lives of trans people, and beyond just like, really beyond the idea of like trans people deserve to exist, but what does trans life look like? What do these decisions look like in the lives of trans people? And it was just really, really, really interesting and really well done. It was written by Tori Peters, who is a trans woman. This was longlisted for the current Women's Prize. It did not make the short list. It was robbed. But I love this book. It was definitely a book that I read over like 4 or 5 days, even though it's only, I think, a little over 300 pages, just because I wanted to really sit with what was being discussed. And I think this is a book that will hold up to multiple rereadings. I feel like I'm going to get something different out of it every time. And more people should read this because I want to talk about it with people. If you've read this book, slide into my DMs. Let's discuss. What is my favorite Own Voices queer book? For an Own Voices queer story, I decided to pick Johnny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead, which it came out a couple years ago, I believe. So Johnny Appleseed is telling the story of Johnny, who is a two-spirit person who has left his reservation, and basically we're following his life after he learns that his stepfather has passed away and needs to return to the reservation to attend the funeral, how he's trying to make enough money to like afford the trip, the bus ticket back, and sort of exploring his life as a sex worker. And also you have like flashbacks to his childhood, growing up on the res, and coming to terms like with his queerness and what that meant for the people around him, like in his relationship to the people around him. And it was just such a like strong singular voice that it made it such a book that like really stuck out in my mind as like, because the author could have really only written that type of book, I think, from like understanding that background and that character so much. So it was just a truly beautifully written book. I listened to it on audio, but I would definitely recommend to, I think, read it in like a physical form. I think I rated this book like a 4.5, but I think if I read it physically, it would have been a like standout 5 for me, because I just think the language really, it's so intricately written that I think a lot of the language would have like sat more impactfully with me if I had read it physically. So I definitely recommend to read it physically. But it's just this like story about this person's life, and I love those types of like queer stories. So I definitely recommend this. Next prompt is for Arrow and Ace representation. What is your favorite book with Ace representation? And y'all, it is A Lat's Way by Darcy Little Badger. I love this book so much. I love it so much. It's a YA book. It's definitely written, I think, kind of in that middle grade to YA. Like, it's definitely written for like middle schoolers, early high schoolers, just with like the ages of the characters, and that's just the vibe I got from a lot of the way the book was constructed. But I loved it. I loved it so much. It's like kind of a genre bending story about a Lat's Way who she can basically call and raise and talk to ghosts. Primarily she does that with animals because people are like too complicated and it gets really bad really fast if you like have a human ghost hanging around for too long. And basically her uncle, I think, or a member of her family was murdered, or they believe it to be murdered, but he died under very suspicious circumstances. And so basically she goes to try and figure out what happened to her uncle. But like, because of the ghost element, it's also like sort of this fantasy world that has like just such interesting, like, it's one of the, I don't usually like urban fantasy and like fantasy that's in our world, but the way that this was done was just brilliant for me. There was like kind of an undercurrent of colonialism and environmental and like climate change stuff that was built into the magic world, and it was just so well done and so clever. I loved it. The mystery like was really well done. I was like kind of guessing until the end, until all the pieces came together. Like, this book just knocked it out of the park for me. I loved it so much. It is so good. And our main character, Lat's Way, is asexual, and that I don't know that she actually uses that word to describe herself, but she definitely talks several times about how she's not going to ever have kids, and that's not something that's in her life plan. And it's like written from a way that's very accepting to that too. So I just really loved it. It was so good. It is an Indigenous owned voices book as well, and I'm just thinking more about it, remembering all these other things I love about the book, but they're spoilers. So definitely go read this. It was really big last year and I loved it so much. The next prompt is, what is it? Pansexual representation. What is your favorite book with pansexual representation? And this one was tricky for me because I don't read a lot of like hard-hitting YA contemporaries where I feel like there is a fair amount of pansexual representation. I read primarily sci-fi and fantasy and like adult literary where, I don't know, I think a lot of older people just don't really identify as pansexual as much as like with the younger generation. So I really haven't read that many books with like called out in the text pansexual representation. But the book that comes to mind when I think about pansexual characters is A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. This is a science fiction sort of slice of life story where it is a very queer normative society. We have all these different alien races with different cultures, and those cultures have different norms, including queerness and like non-monogamy and all of these other sort of things that are just woven into the world, and like that's just how it is. So for one, we love queer normalized society, and there are several characters who are shown to be having sex with different species, different genders. Like, so I feel like that's definitely more on the pansexual representation side. I don't have a copy of the first book, but I think this is the third book in the series that I do have a copy of. So Becky Chambers is phenomenal. I love her work so much. I have not gotten to this one yet, but I'm very excited to. But definitely recommend these books if you have not picked them up yet. And finally, it is what is your favorite book with queer people of color representation, QPOC representation. And for me, I could not get through this list without putting a River Solomon book on it. I almost used this book for several of the other different prompts, but I decided to use it for this one. It could have fit in so many different ones. And that is An Unkindness of Ghosts by River Solomon, which if you have Audible, it's like free on Audible. Go download it right now. It is basically a science fiction book that is based on this generational ship that is going through space to try and find this planet. That's not really the main point of the book, but the society in this generational ship is based on the United States pre-Civil War. So we have the lower decks, which are all the farm workers and labor workers who are all basically Black people and people of color and have brown skin. And there's also like genetic differences that have happened that where these people are really marginalized and oppressed. And then the upper crust of society who has way more space and all these beautiful green spaces is sort of coded as the white gentry. And I love a good generational ship story. Like, it's one of my favorite science fiction like tropes and setups. And this is probably the most well done one. Like, well done setup and conclusion that I've ever read. So we're following our main character, Aster, who is queer and definitely identifies as more on the non-binary side, also is generally considered to be neurodivergent representation. And so the way River Solomon uses that to sort of critique so many different sci-fi tropes is just chef's kiss beautiful. I love it. It's also just such a beautiful, well-crafted story where everything, like every reveal and every like plot change felt deserved. It felt like it fit within the culture that and the society that had been built. So there's not like any like Deus Ex Machina, Machina. None of that is happening in this book, and it's just one of the most well done books like I've ever read. I love it so much. River Solomon is a genius. Please go pick this up. More people need to read it. It's so good. And then finally, we have what queer books are you looking forward to in 2021? And so for this, there's definitely Casey McQuiston has One Last Stop coming out. I haven't managed to pick up a copy of that. River Solomon just had Sorrowland come out. I haven't had a chance to pick that up yet. I want to read more of Becky Chambers' work. So many queer books left to read this year. I'm sure there are many more coming out soon that I don't really keep a good track of like what's coming out. That's not really how I live my life. So I know I have a lot of queer books left on my TBR to read this month and for the rest of the year. But remember to read queer books all year long, not just during Pride. But anyways, thank you all for hanging out. This was a blast. And thank you to Books Past Bedtime for tagging me. Love you, Jess. So I'll see y'all next time.